Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we drift 4,000 years into the past, past the hum of your fan, past the glow of your phone, into a mud brick house on the edge of the Nile, where the air already smells like baked clay and wood smoke before the sun has even cleared the horizon. You're about to become an ordinary Egyptian, and I mean ordinary. No gold sarcophagus, no secret pyramid blueprints, just a person waking up to another humid, sandy, surprisingly ordinary day in one of the most extraordinary civilizations to ever exist. And fair warning, you probably won't survive this. Not the history. You'll survive that fine, I mean the sheer heat, the flies, and the fact that indoor plumbing is not on the menu for another few thousand years.
Welcome to the Sleepy Historian channel. Don't forget to subscribe and like the video.
So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're settled in, drop your location and your local time down in the comments. I like knowing what corner of the world is drifting off with me tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You feel it before you see it. A thin seam of orange light easing under the doorway of your small mud brick home, somewhere along the floodplain of the Nile, sometime around 1350 BCE, give or take a dynasty. There is no alarm clock, there doesn't need to be. The rooster outside has already decided the day has started, and honestly, he's louder than any phone alarm you've ever owned. You blink up at a ceiling made of palm ribs and packed mud, and for a moment you just lie there on your woven reed mat, feeling the cool morning air that will, in about 2 hours, turn into an absolutely relentless furnace. There is no snooze button in ancient Egypt. There is only Ra, dragging his sunboat across the sky whether you're ready or not, and the rest of the household stirring around you like a slow, sleepy machine clicking back into motion. You hear your mother already up, feeding the fire under a clay oven, and somewhere outside a donkey is complaining about something, probably its job, which, to be fair, is a completely reasonable thing to complain about. Ancient Egyptian daily life ran almost entirely on the rhythm of the sun and the river, and that's not poetic exaggeration. That's just literally how people organised their entire existence. Historians still argue whether the average Egyptian thought of time the way we do, as a straight line marching forward, or whether they experienced it more like a cycle, repeating itself every single day the way the sun rose, crossed, and sank into the underworld before doing it all again tomorrow. Either way, waking up wasn't really a choice you made. It was a chore assigned to you by the entire universe. You sit up slowly, your joints a little stiff from sleeping on a mat that's really just woven reeds over a low mud brick platform. If you're lucky, and your family has a bit of status, there might be a proper wooden bed frame with a curved wooden headrest instead of a pillow, which, yes, sounds like a medieval torture device, but was actually meant to keep your head cool and elevated, away from crawling insects. You'll get to test one of those out shortly, and just a heads up, it takes some getting used to. Historians estimate it took about as long to adjust to as one of those weird orthopedic pillows your aunt swears by. Outside, the village, or if you're in a bigger settlement, the town, is already humming. Egypt wasn't one giant unified city of pyramids and pharaohs waving from balconies. Most people, something like 80 to 90% of the population by most estimates, lived rural agricultural lives along a narrow green ribbon hugging the Nile, surrounded on both sides by unforgiving desert. That thin strip of fertile black soil, which the Egyptians themselves literally called Kemet, the Black Land, was basically the only reason any of this civilization could exist at all. Step a few miles off that strip and you're in Deshret, the Red Land, which is a poetic way of saying instant, brutal death by dehydration. You crawl toward the doorway, ducking slightly under the low frame because ancient Egyptian doorways were not built with modern head clearance in mind, and step outside into a courtyard shared with a couple of goats, some chickens, and a cat, who's absolutely, unmistakably in charge of this household. No debate necessary. Cats in Egypt weren't just pets. They were practically employees, valued for keeping grain stores free of mice and snakes, and eventually elevated into genuinely sacred territory associated with the goddess Bastet. This particular cat, however, does not care about theology right now. It wants breakfast, and it wants it from you specifically. The morning air still carries a little coolness, the kind that won't last. Ancient Egyptian settlements didn't sprawl the way modern cities do. Homes were clustered close together, often sharing walls built from sun-dried mud brick because stone was expensive, heavy, and honestly kind of overkill for a house, when you could be saving that stone for something more eternal, like, say, a temple or a very ambitious tomb. Mud brick was cheap, it was local, and it did a surprisingly good job of keeping interiors cool during the day and retaining warmth at night, which is more than I can say for some modern apartments with paper-thin walls. You notice smoke curling from a few chimneys, or really just holes in rooftops as families start their ovens for the day. Bread is basically the backbone of the entire Egyptian diet, and we'll get to that delicious, gritty, occasionally tooth-damaging topic very soon. For now, though, you're just standing in a courtyard as the sky shifts from soft peach to a harsh, confident blue, watching your world slowly assemble itself into another day of labour, ritual, and the quiet, stubborn persistence of people just trying to get through it. Same as anywhere, same as always. A donkey brays again somewhere down the lane, more insistently this time, as if reminding the whole village that morning chores wait for absolutely no one. And with that nagging little bray still echoing, your day and this story begins to properly move. You duck back inside for just a moment, because before anything else happens, before bread, before fields, before the day claims you entirely, there's the matter of getting yourself presentable. And yes, even 4,000 years ago, in a mud brick house with no mirror worth bragging about, people cared deeply about how they looked. Ancient Egyptians were, frankly, a little obsessed with personal hygiene, which might surprise you if your mental image of ancient civilization involves people wandering around dusty and unwashed. Not here. Historians have found more perfume recipes, cosmetic palettes, and grooming tools from Egypt than from almost any other ancient culture, and that tells you something about their priorities. You reach for a small basin of water, maybe drawn from the Nile the evening before and left to settle overnight so the sediment sinks to the bottom. There's no soap as you know it, but there is natron, a naturally occurring mineral salt scraped from dry lake beds, which acts as a decent cleanser, and, fun fact, doubles as one of the key ingredients in mummification. Try not to think too hard about the fact that you're washing your face with the same substance that will one day dry out your organs for the afterlife. Some things you just have to compartmentalise before breakfast. You scrub natron mixed with a little oil across your skin, working it over your arms and face, rinsing with the settled river water. It's not exactly a luxury spa experience, but it does the job, and honestly it smells faintly mineral and clean, not unpleasant at all. Oils were essential here too, not just for scent, but for actual survival. The dry desert air and relentless sun-cracked skin fast. So moisturising wasn't vanity, it was basic maintenance, the ancient equivalent of slathering on sunscreen before you step outside in July. Next comes the coal, and this is where things get genuinely fascinating. You take a small stick, dip it into a dark paste kept in a little stone or ceramic pot, and carefully line your eyes, top and bottom, extending the line slightly outward at the corners. This wasn't just about looking dramatic, although it absolutely did that too. Coal, typically made from ground galena or malachite mixed with fats, served a real practical purpose. It cut down glare from the brutal Egyptian sun, and some researchers believe it may have had mild antibacterial properties that helped protect eyes from infection, which were unfortunately common along the Nile due to certain waterborne parasites. Historians still argue whether the protective benefits were something Egyptians consciously understood, or whether it was a happy accidental byproduct of what was primarily a beauty ritual. Either way, you now have sharp, dramatic eyes and reduced sun glare, which honestly puts most modern sunglasses to shame in terms of multitasking. Both men and women wore kohl, by the way. This wasn't a gendered beauty standard the way eyeliner sometimes gets treated today. Pharaohs wore it, labourers wore it, children sometimes wore it too, partly for the health benefits and partly because, frankly, everyone just liked looking a little sharper before facing the day. Now for clothing. And here's where you'll notice the practicality of the whole outfit immediately. Egyptian fashion, at least for most of the population, was built almost entirely around one material: linen, woven from flax that grew abundantly along the Nile. It's lightweight, breathable and pale in colour, which reflects heat instead of absorbing it. Genuinely smart design for a climate that tries to cook you alive by mid-morning. You wrap a simple kilt around your waist if you're a man, or a straight close-fitting linen dress with shoulder straps if you're a woman, and that's essentially it. No layers, no complicated buttons, nothing that's going to trap heat against your skin. Quality and quantity of linen indicated your status pretty clearly. The finer, more sheer, more brilliantly white the fabric, the wealthier the household, since bleaching and finely weaving linen took serious time and skill. If you're a farmer or labourer, your kilt is going to be a bit coarser, a bit more practical, probably shorter for ease of movement in the fields. If you're wealthier, expect pleating, finer weaves, and maybe a little added flair. You slip on simple sandals woven from papyrus reeds or leather, depending on what your family can afford, though plenty of Egyptians, especially children and labourers, just went barefoot most of the time, saving the sandals for special occasions or rougher terrain. It's a strange thought, walking barefoot across sun-baked ground for most of your life, but calloused feet were just part of the human condition here. No orthopaedic insoles required. Jewellery comes next, if you've got any, and even modest households often had a little something. A simple amulet on a cord, maybe a small string of beads. Jewellery wasn't purely decorative either. It frequently carried protective or religious significance. Little charms meant to ward off bad luck, illness, or malevolent spirits, which, considering how unpredictable ancient life could be, feels like a pretty reasonable insurance policy. By the time you step back out into the courtyard, freshly washed, coal-lined, and dressed in your linen kilt, the sun has climbed noticeably higher, and the smell of baking bread has grown stronger, wafting over from the clay oven your mother's been tending. Your stomach growls right on cue, and honestly, that smell alone is enough to make you forget how early it still technically is. That smell of baking bread pulls you straight toward the courtyard oven, and honestly, your stomach has been negotiating with your brain about this moment since the second you woke up. Breakfast in ancient Egypt wasn't some elaborate spread. No eggs Benedict, no 17 types of pastry. But what it lacked in variety, it made up for in sheer reliability. Bread and beer. That's it. That's breakfast, lunch, an often decent chunk of dinner too, for basically everyone from farmers to pharaohs, just in wildly different qualities and quantities depending on your social standing. You crouch by the oven as your mother pulls out a flat, round loaf, still steaming, slightly blackened on the bottom where it sat closest to the coals. Ancient Egyptian bread was made from emmer wheat or barley, ground on a stone quern into a coarse flour that, and here's the slightly grim, quirky tidbit for tonight, almost always contained tiny bits of grit and sand from the grinding stones themselves. Archaeologists examining Egyptian mummies have found that dental wear was extraordinarily common, teeth worn down to painful stumps by middle age, largely because of this gritty bread people ate every single day of their lives. So next time you complain about a slightly stale bagel, just remember, at least it's probably not slowly sanding down your molars. You tear off a piece. Still warm, dense, a little nutty, a little chewy. It's genuinely good, in a rustic, no-frills sort of way, and you dip it into a small bowl of beer to soften it further, which, don't worry, is completely normal here, and not remotely a breakfast cocktail situation. Egyptian beer, called henket, was thick, cloudy, low in alcohol content, and honestly functioned more like a nutritious porridge drink than what you'd picture as beer today. It was made from fermented barley or bread itself, sometimes flavoured with dates or honey, and it was safer to drink than plain river water, which, depending on the season, could be carrying all sorts of unpleasant bacteria and parasites you'd rather not think about at breakfast. Everyone drank beer here, children included, though presumably a weaker, more diluted version. It wasn't about getting anyone tipsy at sunrise. It was about hydration, nutrition and calories, especially for labourers who needed serious energy to survive a full day of physical work under that unforgiving sun. Historians estimate that workers building royal monuments received beer as part of their daily wages, alongside bread, onions and sometimes a bit of dried fish, which honestly sounds like a pretty solid union contract for 4,000 years ago. As you eat, something skitters across the packed dirt floor near the doorway, and you glance down to see a small glossy scarab beetle wandering past, entirely unbothered by the household activity around it. You'd think this would be startling, a bug just casually strolling through breakfast, but scarab beetles held serious symbolic weight in Egyptian culture, associated with the god Khepri and the daily rebirth of the sun. Watching a real dung beetle roll a ball of, well, dung across the ground apparently reminded ancient Egyptians of the sun being pushed across the sky each day, and from that observation grew an entire cosmology involving self-creation, renewal, and rebirth. It's a genuinely elegant bit of ancient logic, really. Take something you see constantly in daily life and build a whole spiritual framework around it. This particular beetle, however, seems less interested in cosmic symbolism and more interested in the crumb that just fell near your foot. Your mother shoos it gently outside, no drama, no shrieking, just the practical acknowledgement that bugs are simply part of life when your walls are mud brick and your floor is packed earth. Flies especially were a constant, near inescapable presence, drawn by livestock, food, and the general warmth, and Egyptians developed all sorts of methods to deal with them, from woven fly whisks to, in some records, wearing certain scented oils specifically meant to repel insects. There's even a slightly wild bit of trivia historians debate. Some ancient soldiers reportedly received golden fly medals for valour in battle, a strange but oddly fitting symbol in a land where flies were such a persistent daily nuisance that surviving them practically counted as a small victory. Breakfast wraps up quickly, because there's no lingering over coffee here, mainly because coffee doesn't exist yet and won't for a very, very long time. Instead, the household starts organising itself for the day's real work. Your father is already checking tools by the door, your older siblings pulling on sandals, and somewhere outside you can hear the low murmur of neighbours doing the exact same routine in their own courtyards. This whole village waking up and fueling itself on bread, beer and habit. You take one last bite, wipe your hands on a cloth, and glance out toward the fields stretching beyond the village edge, still shadowed and cool in the early light, but not for much longer. The Nile glints somewhere past the palm trees, patient and enormous, and you already sense that wherever your day is heading, it's going to be shaped by that river more than anything else, which, as it turns out, is exactly where this story heads next. You step past the last row of mud brick houses, and the village gives way to open fields, still damp with dew, stretching out toward a horizon smudged green and gold under the climbing sun. And here's the thing you need to understand before anything else about farming life in ancient Egypt. None of it, not one single decision, gets made without first asking what the Nile is doing. The river wasn't just a water source. It was basically the operating system running the entire civilization, and everyone from the pharaoh down to the lowest field hand lived by its rhythm. Each year, the Nile flooded, and this wasn't seen as a disaster the way flooding usually is for us. It was the single most anticipated, celebrated event of the entire calendar. Egyptians even built their whole year around it, dividing time into 3 seasons. Akhet, the inundation, when the river rose and spread nutrient-rich black silt across the farmland. Pere, the growing season, when that freshly fertilized soil produced crops. And Shemu, the harvest, when everything got gathered in before the heat turned brutal and dry. You're currently standing right at the edge of Pere, watching workers turn soil that's still dark, moist, and practically begging to be planted. The flooding itself came from rains and snowmelt thousands of miles south in the Ethiopian highlands, though obviously no one in your village has any concept of that geography. To them, the flood was a gift from the god Hapi, a plump androgynous deity often depicted with a big belly and pendulous chest, symbolizing abundance and fertility. Historians still argue whether Hapi's unusual androgynous depiction reflected some deeper theological concept about balance between masculine and feminine creative forces, or whether it was simply an artistic shorthand for overflowing, nurturing abundance. Either way, temples all along the river held ceremonies begging Hapi for a good, generous flood, because too little water meant famine, and too much meant villages washed away. So this was a genuinely nerve-wracking annual gamble dressed up in religious ritual. You watch a farmer nearby use a simple wooden plough pulled by a pair of oxen, cutting shallow furrows into the soft black earth. It's not a complicated tool, really just a curved wooden blade attached to a frame, but it does the job, breaking up soil that's already been softened by the flood. Behind him, another worker scatters seed by hand, broadcasting it across the furrows, while a third drives a small herd of sheep or pigs across the field to trample the seeds down into the soil, which honestly sounds like it shouldn't work, but apparently 4,000 years of practice says otherwise. Wheat and barley were the backbone crops here, feeding directly into that bread and beer situation from earlier. You can now appreciate just how much labour sat behind that warm loaf you tore into this morning. But fields also grew flax for linen, vegetables like onions, garlic, lettuce and cucumbers, and fruit like dates, figs and pomegranates. Onions especially held a bit of a strange cultural spotlight. Some ancient sources suggest certain priests avoided eating them due to their pungent smell being considered ritually unclean, though ordinary farmers had no such concerns and ate them constantly, layered into bread or eaten raw straight out of the field. Irrigation was where things got genuinely clever. Since the flood didn't reach every field evenly, farmers built networks of small canals and basins to direct water where it was needed, and later a tool called the shut-off came into use, a simple counterweighted lever system that let a single person lift water from a canal or the river and pour it into higher fields, saving enormous amounts of labour compared to hauling buckets by hand. It's a wonderfully simple bit of engineering, and honestly, versions of the shadif are still used in parts of Egypt and elsewhere today, which is a pretty remarkable testament to good design surviving basically unchanged for millennia. Farming here wasn't optional labour for the poor alone either. Nearly everyone who wasn't part of the small elite class of priests, scribes, or nobility spent at least part of their year working the land, including during the flood season, when regular farming paused, and able-bodied men were often conscripted into labour for state-building projects instead. Yes, that includes the pyramids, and no, they weren't built by slaves in chains the way old Hollywood movies love to suggest. Archaeological evidence from workers' villages near Giza shows organised labour crews paid in food and beer, with their own cemeteries, medical care, and even labour union-like grievance systems. It's honestly one of the more satisfying historical corrections in Egyptology, replacing a myth of oppressed slaves with a picture of a genuinely organised, if gruelling, national workforce. You help haul a woven basket of freshly cut flax toward a drying area, your palms already a little raw from the rough plant fibres, sweat starting to bead along your hairline as the morning sun climbs higher and loses its earlier gentleness. Somewhere across the field, someone starts singing a low, rhythmic work song, the kind that keeps everyone's movements loosely synced without anyone really thinking about it, and the sound carries strangely far across the flat, open land. And it's that same rhythm, that same sense of coordinated labour, that will carry you next toward the men shaping stone and building monuments meant to outlast every single person currently standing in this field. You leave the fields behind, following a dusty path that curves toward the edge of the desert plateau, where the land turns from soft black soil to pale, cracked earth almost instantly, like someone drew a line with a ruler. And it's here, right at that boundary between the living green world and the dry eternal desert, that some of ancient Egypt's most extraordinary work is happening. Not in the fields, but in stone. You hear it before you see it. A steady rhythmic clinking, chisel against limestone, dozens of hands working in careful, practiced unison. As you crest a small rise, the sight opens up in front of you. Workers swarming over half-finished walls and column bases, some hauling blocks on wooden sledges, others up on scaffolding made of lashed timber, carefully smoothing stone surfaces that will, centuries from now, still be standing, while everyone currently touching them has long since turned to dust and memory. Building in stone was reserved for things meant to last forever. Temples, tombs, monuments to gods and kings, while ordinary homes, as you already know, stuck with humble mud brick. There's a certain poetry in that division, honestly. The Egyptians built their eternal sacred structures out of the hardest, most permanent material available, while accepting that everyday human life was, by contrast, temporary, meant to be lived in something soft and impermanent that would eventually just dissolve back into the earth. You watch a team of men manoeuvring a massive limestone block onto a wooden sledge, then dragging it along a specially prepared track that's been dampened with water. This is one of those historical debates people love arguing about. How exactly did the Egyptians move such massive stones without modern machinery? And it's honestly settled more than pop culture gives it credit for. Wetting the sand ahead of the sledge dramatically reduces friction, a fact actually confirmed by physicists studying an ancient Egyptian tomb painting that depicts a worker pouring water in front of a sledge hauling a colossal statue. Historians still argue over the finer logistics, like exact ramp designs for the largest pyramids, whether straight ramps, spiralling ramps, or some internal ramp system was used. But the fundamental technique of wet sand and coordinated human muscle is well established. No aliens required, despite what certain corners of the internet insist on believing. Nearby, a group of sculptors work on a wall relief, chiseling out figures of gods and pharaohs in profile, that distinctive Egyptian style where the head faces sideways but the eye and shoulders face forward. a stylistic convention that lasted for literally thousands of years with barely any deviation. It's not because Egyptian artists couldn't draw a proper side profile, by the way. That's a common misconception. This style followed strict artistic and religious rules, meant to represent the human body in its most complete, recognisable and ideologically correct form for eternity, not to capture a realistic snapshot of a single fleeting moment. Realism wasn't really the goal here. Permanence and clarity were. You crouch beside a painter mixing pigment in a small stone bowl, grinding minerals like malachite for green, ochre for warm yellows and reds, and a striking blue made from ground azurite or a manufactured compound now called Egyptian blue, considered one of the first synthetic pigments in human history. It's a genuinely remarkable bit of ancient chemistry, produced by heating together sand, copper and natron at very specific temperatures, and it's held its colour for thousands of years, still visible on temple walls today, arguably more vibrant than some paint jobs I've seen on houses built within the last decade. The crews working here aren't some faceless anonymous mass either. Ancient Egyptian labour was highly organised, divided into gangs, often with playful or boastful names. One famous example from records at Giza includes a crew nicknamed Friends of Khufu, suggesting an actual sense of pride, competition and camaraderie among workers, not unlike modern construction crews razzing each other over whose team finishes their section faster. These workers received rations of bread, beer, meat and vegetables, and evidence from their nearby settlements shows they had access to medical treatment for injuries, which, given the physical toll of hauling multi-ton stone blocks, was probably a fairly regular necessity. A supervisor walks past, checking measurements with a length of knotted rope used to lay out precise right angles and consistent proportions, a surprisingly elegant low-tech surveying method that let ancient builders achieve remarkable architectural precision without a single modern tool. You watch him nod, satisfied, and move on to the next section, and there's something quietly impressive about the whole operation, this enormous coordinated human effort, no blueprints in the way you'd imagine them, no machinery beyond rope, wood, water, and sheer stubborn persistence, slowly, patiently assembling something meant to outlast every single person currently sweating under this relentless sun. You linger a moment longer, watching dust motes catch the light near a half-carved doorway, before turning back toward the village path, because not everyone here works with stone and muscle. Some, you're about to discover, wield something arguably even more powerful, a reed pen, a pot of ink, and the ability to read and write in a society where that skill alone could completely rewrite your entire future. The path back toward the village takes you past a low, shaded building with an open doorway, and through it drifts a very different sound from the chiseling and shouting of the construction site. A quiet, steady scratching, almost meditative, like fingernails lightly tapping wood. You step inside, and your eyes adjust to a room where a handful of young boys sit cross-legged on the floor, each with a wooden board balanced on their knees, carefully copying symbols onto pieces of broken pottery called ostraca, which served as the ancient equivalent of scratch paper, way cheaper and more disposable than actual papyrus. This is a scribal school, and if you're picturing something relaxed and encouraging, gently correct that image immediately. Becoming a scribe in ancient Egypt was one of the most prestigious, desirable career paths available, and the training was notoriously strict, occasionally outright brutal. One surviving text, sometimes called the Satire of the Trades, has a scribe lecturing his son on why literally every other profession is miserable and physically punishing compared to being a scribe, and it includes the memorable line, more or less, that a boy's ear is on his back, meaning he listens best when beaten, which, yes, corporal punishment was a fairly normalised part of scribal education here, uncomfortable as that is to sit with by modern standards. You watch one boy, maybe around 10 years old, carefully drawing hieroglyphic signs, his tongue poking slightly out in concentration. Hieroglyphs are gorgeous, honestly, this incredibly detailed pictorial writing system, combining logograms representing whole words and phonograms representing sounds, over 700 distinct signs in common use, ranging from simple birds and snakes to elaborate depictions of thrones, water, and human figures. But hieroglyphs, gorgeous as they are, were mostly reserved for monumental, formal writing, carved into temple walls and tomb inscriptions, things meant to last forever, quite literally. For everyday writing, scribes actually used a faster, more simplified script called hieratic, a kind of cursive shorthand derived from hieroglyphic forms, but much quicker to write with a reed brush on papyrus. This is what most administrative records, letters, and business documents actually used, and it's honestly the version of Egyptian writing that kept the whole civilization's bureaucracy functioning day to day. Historians still argue over exactly how literacy rates broke down across the population, with estimates ranging anywhere from under 1% to around 5% of the total population being able to read and write, which sounds tiny by modern standards, but represented enormous concentrated power for those who possessed the skill, and that power was very real. A trained scribe could work in temple administration, royal treasury accounts, legal record keeping, medical texts, or as a personal secretary to nobility, all while being exempt from the grueling physical labour and military conscription that shaped so much of ordinary Egyptian life. It's honestly not that different from certain modern career calculations, trading years of tough, unpaid, exhausting training for a lifetime of comparatively comfortable, respected work afterward. The satire of the trades wasn't subtle about this trade-off either, gleefully describing farmers plagued by worms and fevers, metalworkers with fingers like crocodile hide, and washermen working alongside crocodiles in the literal Nile, all compared unfavourably to the clean, seated, intellectually respected life of a scribe. You crouch down near one boy's workspace and notice his tools laid out carefully. A wooden pallet with small round wells for holding red and black ink, made from ground minerals mixed with water and a binding agent, a small water pot for mixing and rinsing, and a bundle of thin reed brushes, their tips chewed and softened to create a workable point. Red ink was typically reserved for headings, corrections, or emphasis, functioning almost exactly like a modern red editing pen, while black formed the main body of text. It's a wonderfully familiar bit of continuity, honestly, this idea of red ink meaning pay attention here, stretching back thousands of years before anyone had ever heard of a teacher's grading pen. Papyrus itself, when boys graduated to actually using it, was made from the pith of the papyrus plant, sliced into thin strips, layered in a crosshatch pattern, then pressed and dried until the natural plant sugars bonded the layers into a smooth, durable writing surface. It wasn't cheap, though, which is exactly why practice happened on broken pottery shards first, saving the genuinely valuable papyrus for final official documents. A slightly quirky tidbit worth tucking away here: some surviving ostraca aren't official practice at all, but rather ancient doodles, jokes, and even what looks suspiciously like early comic strips. Satirical drawings of animals acting like humans, cats serving mice, mice riding chariots pulled by dogs. It's a wonderfully human little detail, evidence that even in a rigid, disciplined educational system, kids still found ways to be a little silly when the teacher wasn't looking. Some things really don't change no matter how many thousands of years separate us. You watch the teacher walk slowly between the rows, occasionally pausing to correct a boy's grip on his reed brush or point out a poorly formed sign, his expression stern but not unkind, and there's a quiet, focused energy to the whole room that feels surprisingly familiar, honestly, not unlike any classroom you've ever sat in yourself. And it's that same disciplined, careful precision that will carry these boys eventually out into the noisy, chaotic heart of the village, toward the marketplace, where all this careful record-keeping actually gets put to practical everyday use. The scratching of reed brushes fades behind you as the path opens into noise, genuine, chaotic, wonderfully alive noise. Shouting voices, braying donkeys, the clatter of pottery, and underneath it all, the low murmur of dozens of overlapping conversations and negotiations. You've reached the marketplace, and it is nothing like a modern shopping trip. No fixed prices, no cashiers, no receipts, just a sprawling open-air tangle of stalls, blankets spread on the ground, and people haggling with the kind of enthusiastic, theatrical energy usually reserved for family arguments about holiday dinner plans. Here's the thing that surprises most people about ancient Egyptian economics. There was no coined money, not for the vast majority of Egyptian history anyway. Coinage didn't really enter common Egyptian use until much later periods, influenced by Greek and Persian contact. For most of Egyptian civilization, the entire economy ran on barter, direct exchange of goods and services, sometimes measured against standardized units of value like Deben, a weight measurement, usually based on copper, though sometimes silver or gold, used as a kind of accounting benchmark rather than an actual physical coin changing hands. You watch a woman trade a woven basket of onions and garlic for a pair of leather sandals, both parties eyeing each other's goods with the practiced scepticism of people who've done this exact dance 100 times before. There's a bit of theatre to it too, some exaggerated reluctance, a slow walk away that gets interrupted by a slightly improved offer, and eventually a satisfied nod that seals the deal. Historians still argue over exactly how standardised these barter values really were in practice, versus how much came down to individual negotiation skill and social relationships. But either way, it clearly worked well enough to sustain a massive, complex civilization for thousands of years without a single coin ever needing to jingle in anyone's pocket. Stalls around you sell an enormous variety of goods. Fresh produce from the surrounding fields, obviously, onions, lettuce, cucumbers, dates, figs, but also pottery, woven baskets, sandals, jewellery made from faience, a bright blue-green glazed ceramic material that was hugely popular and relatively affordable compared to genuine turquoise or lapis lazuli. You spot a stall selling small carved amulets, protective charms shaped like scarabs, the Eye of Horus, or various protective deities, popular purchases for anyone hoping for a little extra spiritual insurance against illness, bad luck, or hostile spirits, which, given the general unpredictability of ancient life, feels like a pretty reasonable purchase to make. Fish sellers have set up near a small canal, their catch still glistening and occasionally still twitching, and the smell here is sharp, briny, mixing uncomfortably with the sweeter scent of dates and the earthy smell of livestock penned nearby. A butcher works nearby too, though meat was actually a bit of a luxury for ordinary households, reserved mostly for festivals, special occasions, or wealthier families, while most people got their protein from fish, legumes, and occasionally poultry, since the Nile provided an abundant, reliable fish supply that didn't require the expense of raising and slaughtering livestock. You pause at a stall selling small, delicate glass and faience beads, watching the vendor arrange them by colour, and it's genuinely striking how much craftsmanship and artistry went into even modest, everyday jewellery here. Beauty wasn't reserved purely for the elite. Ordinary Egyptians clearly valued personal adornment enough to trade real goods for it, even when times were tight, which honestly says something rather touching about how consistently humans have prioritised a little beauty and self-expression even under difficult circumstances across basically every era of history. A slightly comedic scene unfolds nearby as a merchant and a customer get into an increasingly animated dispute over the quality of some linen cloth, gesturing wildly, drawing a small crowd of amused bystanders who seem more interested in the spectacle than actually intervening. Marketplace disputes weren't purely informal either. Ancient Egypt had a surprisingly developed legal system, and unresolved disagreements could genuinely be brought before local officials or courts, with written contracts sometimes drawn up for larger transactions witnessed and recorded by, unsurprisingly, scribes, connecting this noisy marketplace directly back to those quiet classrooms you just left behind. You notice something else too, scanning the crowd. Women conducting business directly and independently, buying, selling, negotiating without needing a male relative's supervision or permission. This wasn't unusual or scandalous here. Egyptian women held notably more independent legal and economic rights compared to many other ancient civilizations, including the ability to own property, initiate divorce, and run their own business dealings. A detail we'll circle back to a little later when we talk more about household life and the surprisingly significant authority some women held. By the time you've wound your way through the last row of stalls, the sun has climbed high and merciless overhead. The shadows have shrunk down to almost nothing, and the marketplace noise has started to thin slightly as people begin drifting toward shade, toward home, toward whatever relief they can find from a heat that's now genuinely punishing. And that instinct, that universal pull toward shelter and stillness, is about to lead you into one of the most sensible, universally adopted survival strategies ancient Egypt ever developed. By midday, the world outside has essentially stopped arguing with itself. The marketplace noise you left behind has thinned into a low, occasional murmur. Shutters have been pulled across doorways, and the streets, so full of movement just an hour ago, are eerily quiet, baked white under a sun that's now directly overhead, casting almost no shadow at all. You duck back into the cool shade of your family's courtyard, and it's an almost physical relief, like stepping into a different climate entirely. This is siesta time, essentially, though the Egyptians obviously didn't call it that. But the underlying logic is universal and frankly extremely sensible. When the sun turns genuinely dangerous, you stop working, you find shade, and you wait it out. Temperatures along the Nile Valley during summer months could regularly climb past 40 degrees Celsius, well over 100 Fahrenheit, and doing hard physical labour in that kind of heat, without modern hydration science, sunscreen, or climate control wasn't just uncomfortable, it was genuinely dangerous, capable of causing heat stroke and death if people pushed through it carelessly. So the whole rhythm of the day bent around, avoiding exactly that. You settle onto a woven mat in the shaded corner of the courtyard, where thick mud brick walls do a genuinely impressive job of keeping interior temperatures notably cooler than outside. That same practical building material from earlier in the day proving its worth yet again. Some wealthier homes had clever architectural features specifically designed for this, like wind catchers, tall vents positioned to funnel any available breeze down into living spaces, an early, entirely passive form of air conditioning that architects still study and occasionally borrow from today, which is honestly a pretty remarkable legacy for a design trick this old. Around you, the household settles into quiet, low-energy activity. Younger children nap outright, sprawled on mats in whatever shade they can find, while adults might rest, chat quietly, or do lighter tasks that don't require standing in direct sun, mending clothes, sorting grain, weaving baskets from reeds. It's not that all productivity stops entirely, more that the nature of work shifts, becoming smaller, slower, more contained, matching the oppressive weight of the heat pressing down outside. You notice your grandmother sitting nearby, working a small hand loom, her fingers moving with the kind of practiced, unhurried rhythm that comes from doing something for 60-plus years. Weaving was an enormously important household and economic activity here, and while men certainly wove too, especially in larger workshop settings, domestic weaving within the household was frequently associated with women's work, producing linen cloth not just for family use, but often for trade or as part of household income. It's slow, meditative work, and in this heat, with this pace, it fits the mood of the day perfectly. This unhurried, patient rhythm that the whole village seems to have collectively agreed upon. A cat, possibly the same self-important one from this morning, or possibly an entirely different self-important cat, has claimed the coolest, shadiest corner of the courtyard for itself, sprawled out in that boneless way cats manage, utterly unbothered by anything happening around it. Genuinely, if you want a role model for surviving an Egyptian midday, look no further than any cat in any Egyptian household, ever, across the entire span of this civilization. They figured out the assignment immediately and have never once second-guessed it. Someone offers you water, drawn from a large ceramic jar kept in the coolest part of the house, sometimes wrapped in wet cloth to encourage evaporative cooling. An old simple trick that actually works remarkably well in dry heat, dropping the water temperature noticeably below the surrounding air. You drink gratefully, the water slightly earthy tasting, carrying that faint mineral quality of Nile water, even after settling, and it's honestly one of the more comforting small pleasures of the whole day so far. Historians still argue over exactly how universally this midday rest pattern applied across all social classes and professions. Certain jobs, particularly those tied to religious or administrative duties within cooler stone temple interiors, may have continued relatively unaffected, since temple structures were specifically designed with thick walls and minimal window openings to stay naturally cool year-round. But for anyone working outdoors, in fields, at construction sites, in the open marketplace, the brutal midday heat effectively forced a pause, a universal, climate-imposed truce between labour and survival that no pharaoh's decree could override, because you genuinely cannot outstubborn a desert sun at its peak. You find yourself drifting, eyelids heavy despite the early hour, lulled by the low hum of quiet household activity and the distant occasional bray of a donkey somewhere that clearly hasn't gotten the memo about resting. It's a strange, pleasant kind of stillness, this enforced pause in the middle of an otherwise demanding day. And as your eyes start to close just for a few minutes, just to steal a little relief from the heat, you can't help noticing how much of this household's rhythm, its quiet authority and steady management, seems to be running through the women around you, which, as it turns out, deserves a much closer look. You wake from your brief midday doze to the sound of quiet, purposeful movement, and as your eyes adjust, you realise it's your mother, back on her feet already, directing the afternoon's household tasks with the kind of easy, practiced authority that makes it obvious she's been running this operation for a very long time. And this is a good moment to properly address something that often surprises people when they first learn about ancient Egypt. Women here held a genuinely notable degree of legal, economic and social independence, especially compared to many other ancient civilizations happening around the same time. Egyptian women could own property outright, in their own name, not as an extension of a husband or father's holdings. They could buy and sell that property, enter into legal contracts, and if a marriage fell apart, women could initiate divorce themselves, not merely have it initiated against them. Marriage itself wasn't even a formal religious or state ceremony in the way you might expect, but functioned more like a recognised legal and social arrangement, often sealed simply by a woman moving into her husband's household, with property and inheritance rights carefully protected by surviving legal documents and marriage contracts that historians have recovered and translated. Your mother, right now, is managing what amounts to a small functioning business. Running a household here wasn't just cooking and cleaning, though obviously that was part of it too. It was overseeing food production and storage, managing servants or hired labour if the family could afford it, brewing beer, weaving linen, and often handling trade and negotiation for goods the household produced beyond its own needs. In wealthier households, women managed genuinely substantial estates, and there's solid evidence of women acting as independent business owners, running their own workshops, particularly in textile production, which, given how central linen was to the entire Egyptian economy, meant some women controlled genuinely significant economic influence. Religious life offered similar opportunities. Women could serve as priestesses, particularly within cults dedicated to female deities like Hathor or Isis, conducting rituals, managing temple resources, and holding positions of real religious authority within their communities. The title, God's Wife of Amun, eventually became one of the most powerful religious and political positions in Egypt, especially during certain later periods, held by women who wielded influence rivaling that of the pharaoh himself in specific religious and economic domains. Historians still argue over exactly how much genuine political power these religious titles carried in different eras versus how symbolic they may have been, since the answer seems to shift considerably depending on the specific dynasty and political context. But the sheer existence of such powerful, formally recognised female religious roles remains remarkably significant regardless of the debate's finer details. And then, of course, there's the most obvious example of female authority in ancient Egyptian history, women who ruled as pharaoh outright. Hatshepsut is probably the most famous example, ruling successfully for around 2 decades, commissioning ambitious building projects and trade expeditions, and notably being depicted in some official art wearing the traditional false beard and regalia associated with kingship, not because anyone was confused about her gender, but because that imagery represented the office and authority of Pharaoh itself, which had, until then, been almost exclusively coded as male. It's a fascinating bit of ancient political theatre, honestly, adopting the visual language of an office to legitimise an unconventional occupant of that office. Back in your own considerably less politically ambitious household, your mother directs your younger sister toward the grinding stone to prepare more flour for tomorrow's bread, while instructing another relative on portioning dried fish for storage. There's a clear division of labour happening, but it's collaborative, practical, everyone contributing according to age, ability and skill, rather than any rigid, unquestionable gendered hierarchy. Men typically handled more of the outdoor agricultural and construction labour, as you've already seen firsthand today, while women often managed more of the household's internal economy, though these lines blurred constantly depending on family circumstances, wealth, and specific local customs. A quirky little tidbit worth tucking away here. Surviving letters between Egyptian family members occasionally show wives writing quite bluntly and confidently to husbands, sometimes even scolding them over financial decisions or household management, while the husband was away on labour duty or military service, which honestly reads as remarkably relatable. This same universal dynamic of domestic frustration and long-distance nagging, preserved on broken pottery shards for thousands of years, proving that certain aspects of marriage really are timeless. You watch your mother pause, hands on hips, surveying the courtyard's afternoon activity with clear satisfaction, before turning her attention toward you and your siblings, who have predictably been getting distracted rather than helping. And speaking of distraction, that particular scolding look on her face is about to lead directly into a conversation about exactly what the younger members of this household get up to when chores aren't strictly demanding their full attention, which, as you're about to discover, involves considerably more games, mischief and early apprenticeship than you might expect. Your mother's pointed look sends you and your younger cousins scattering toward the far side of the courtyard, where a handful of children have already gathered, and it's genuinely comforting to see that some things really haven't changed much across 4,000 years. Kids finding ways to play the second adult supervision loosens even slightly. Childhood in ancient Egypt wasn't some grim, joyless stretch of pure labour, despite how much responsibility got layered onto young shoulders here compared to what you're probably used to. There was real, documented play, and it looks surprisingly familiar. You watch a group of children crouched in a circle, tossing small carved knuckle bones, actual sheep or goat ankle bones, worn smooth from repeated use, in a game that's essentially an ancient ancestor of modern dice games, betting small trinkets or simply bragging rights on the outcome. Archaeologists have recovered enormous quantities of these knuckle bones from Egyptian sites, along with small clay and stone balls, wooden tops that could be spun with a whip-like cord, and dolls with movable limbs and even actual hair made from strung beads or clay, remarkably close in concept to toys you'd recognise instantly today. A board game called Senet gets set up nearby on a low wooden table, and this one deserves special attention because it's genuinely one of the oldest known board games in human history, with archaeological evidence stretching back well over 5,000 years. It's played on a grid of 30 squares, using flat disc-shaped pieces moved according to throws of casting sticks or knuckle bones functioning like dice, and the exact original rules remain, appropriately, a matter of ongoing scholarly reconstruction, since no complete rulebook survives. Historians still argue over precisely how it was played in its earliest forms, though enough tomb paintings and inscriptions survive to piece together a reasonably confident general structure. What's genuinely fascinating is that Senet wasn't just entertainment, it also carried serious religious symbolism later in its history, representing the soul's journey through the afterlife. So this seemingly simple game apparently doubled as a kind of casual everyday meditation on mortality, which is a lot of philosophical weight for what's essentially ancient checkers. Nearby, a few older boys wrestle in a cleared patch of dirt, and wrestling was genuinely popular and culturally significant here, appearing frequently in tomb paintings showing detailed sequences of holds and throws, almost like ancient instructional diagrams. Physical competition mattered, partly for entertainment, partly because physical fitness and combat skill had genuine practical value in a society where military service, hunting and hard labour were common expectations for men. You watch one boy get flipped onto his back, letting out an exaggerated groan of defeat while his friends laugh, and honestly, the whole scene could be lifted directly from any modern schoolyard with barely any adjustment needed. Swimming happened too, obviously, given the omnipresent Nile, and children learned early, both for recreation and because it was a genuinely practical survival skill in a landscape defined by water. Some tomb depictions even show children playing in reed boats or splashing in shallow canals, supervised loosely by older siblings or nearby adults, though the Nile carried real dangers too. Crocodiles and hippos both pose genuine, serious threats, and Egyptian art and mythology reflects a healthy cultural respect, occasionally bordering on outright terror, toward both animals. But childhood here wasn't purely play, and this is where things shift towards something a bit more serious. Formal, extended childhood as a distinct life stage, in the way you probably think of it, lasted a comparatively short time. By around age 5, children were already being introduced to household responsibilities and basic skills, and by their early teens, many had essentially transitioned into adult work, entering apprenticeships in whatever trade their family practiced, or arranging into whatever role their social class made available. If your father is a farmer, you're learning to farm. If your father is a craftsman, you're likely learning that specific craft, often starting with simple supervised tasks and gradually taking on more skilled work as you demonstrate competence. For boys destined for scribal training, that path started notably earlier and more intensively than most other apprenticeships, which circles back to that classroom you visited earlier today, those young boys already deep into years of disciplined, occasionally harsh, education. Girls, meanwhile, more commonly apprenticed directly under their mothers or other female relatives, learning household management, weaving, food preparation, and depending on family circumstances, sometimes business and trade skills too, given how much economic activity women handled here, as you already learned this afternoon. A slightly quirky, genuinely charming tidbit worth remembering. Some surviving artefacts include small wooden and clay toy animals with articulated, movable parts, crocodiles with snapping jaws worked by a small string, and lions with moving legs, essentially ancient pull toys and puppets, proving that Egyptian craftsmen put real creative effort into making children's playthings genuinely engaging rather than just simple static carvings. There's something quietly touching about that detail. Honestly, this evidence that even amid all the labour, ritual and mortality-focused seriousness of Egyptian life, adults still clearly valued making childhood a little bit delightful. You glance toward the knucklebone game again, tempted to join before your responsibilities inevitably pull you elsewhere, and as the dice-like bones clatter across the packed earth one more time, your attention drifts toward the low, distant silhouette of a temple roofline visible over the courtyard wall, its presence a quiet, constant reminder that behind all this ordinary daily life, an entirely separate, more sacred rhythm has been running in parallel all along, one you're about to step a little closer toward. The temple sits at the edge of the village like it belongs to an entirely different world, and in a very real sense, it does. Its walls rise pale and cool against the harsh afternoon light, thick stone blocks carved with rows of hieroglyphs and painted reliefs, depicting gods, offerings, and pharaohs performing rituals that stretch back further than anyone alive can properly trace. You approach slowly, and even from a respectful distance outside the outer courtyard, there's a noticeable shift in atmosphere, quieter, more deliberate, the ordinary noise of village life fading into something closer to reverent hush. Here's something that might genuinely surprise you. Ordinary Egyptians, people like you, like your family, generally did not go inside the temple's inner sanctuary. Ever. Not for regular worship, not for weekly services, nothing resembling the congregational religious experience you might be picturing. Egyptian temples weren't community gathering places in that sense at all. They functioned essentially as the literal earthly homes of the gods, and access to the innermost, most sacred chambers was restricted almost exclusively to pharaoh and specially trained, ritually purified priests who acted, quite literally, as intermediaries handling the god's daily physical needs on behalf of the entire kingdom. You watch a priest emerge briefly from a side doorway, freshly shaved head gleaming slightly with oil, wearing pristine white linen robes, and this appearance isn't incidental. Priests maintained extremely strict standards of ritual purity, which included shaving their entire bodies regularly, bathing multiple times daily in sacred pools, avoiding certain foods considered ritually impure, and wearing only linen, never wool, since wool came from animals and was considered less pure than plant-derived linen. It's an intense, disciplined lifestyle, honestly, though it's worth noting that for much of Egyptian history, priesthood wasn't necessarily a full-time, permanent occupation the way you might assume. Many priests actually served on a rotating basis, working temple duties for a set period each year, maybe 1 month out of 4, then returning to entirely separate professions, farming, scribal work, or trade, for the remaining time. Historians still argue over exactly how consistently this rotational system operated across different periods and temple hierarchies, since practices clearly varied by era and location, but the general pattern of part-time, rotating priestly service is well documented. Inside, hidden from your view but described in surviving temple records and inscriptions, the daily ritual unfolds with almost obsessive, precise repetition. Each morning, designated priests would approach the innermost shrine housing the god's cult statue, a relatively small, often gold-covered image believed to actually house the deity's spirit when properly maintained. The priest would break the clay seal from the previous night, open the shrine doors, and essentially treat the statue exactly like an honoured living guest requiring full personal care. The statue would be ritually washed, anointed with fragrant oils, dressed in fresh linen garments, adorned with jewellery, and presented with food offerings, bread, meat, beer, fruit, arranged with the same careful presentation you'd give an actual visiting dignitary. It's a genuinely fascinating bit of ancient theology when you sit with it for a moment. The gods, in this belief system, weren't distant, abstract forces observing from some untouchable realm. They required daily, tangible, physical maintenance, performed with meticulous consistency, because neglecting these rituals wasn't just religiously improper, it was believed to genuinely threaten cosmic order itself, the ongoing balance the Egyptians called ma'at, encompassing truth, justice, and the fundamental stability of the universe. Skip too many rituals, offend the gods through neglect, and you're not just risking bad luck, you're risking the actual unravelling of cosmic and social order, which is an enormous weight of responsibility to place on a handful of priests quietly washing a statue behind closed doors every single morning. After the gods' needs were addressed, interestingly, the food offerings weren't simply left to spoil. Once presented and symbolically consumed by the deity's spiritual essence, the physical food itself would later be redistributed, often to temple staff and workers as part of their compensation, an efficient bit of practical resourcefulness layered underneath the religious ritual, ensuring nothing genuinely went to waste in a society that generally couldn't afford much waste at all. Meanwhile, outside the temple's restricted inner areas, ordinary people like you did have religious outlets available, just structured very differently than direct temple worship. Public festivals occurred regularly throughout the year, occasions when the god statue, or sometimes a smaller portable version, would actually be carried outside in elaborate processions, giving ordinary Egyptians a rare, genuinely exciting opportunity to witness, celebrate, and even briefly interact with the divine presence normally kept hidden away. These festivals involved music, dancing, feasting, and considerable public celebration, functioning as some of the biggest, most anticipated social events of the entire year, closer in spirit and energy to a massive modern parade or street festival than anything resembling a solemn church service. Beyond festivals, personal household-level religious practice filled the gap for daily spiritual life, small shrines kept within homes, prayers and offerings made to household protective deities, and that string of protective amulets you might be wearing right now, purchased earlier today from that marketplace stall, functioning as your own small, personal, portable connection to divine protection. You glance back once more at the temple's imposing silhouette, its secrets and rituals still largely hidden from view, before turning toward home, where the afternoon's remaining tasks are waiting, including a visit to someone whose work bridges the gap between the physical body and those same unseen powerful spiritual forces the temple exists to manage. Your feet carry you back toward the village centre, past the temple, past the marketplace, toward a small, unassuming building where a thin trail of smoke curls up from burning incense, mixed with something sharper, more medicinal underneath. This is where you'll find the local healer, and if you're imagining someone purely focused on chanting spells over a sick patient, you'll want to adjust that picture considerably, because ancient Egyptian medicine was a genuinely fascinating, occasionally startling blend of real, practical clinical knowledge and deeply embedded magical religious belief, operating side by side without any real sense of contradiction. You duck inside and find a physician, called a swandabu, examining a patient's arm clearly injured, wrapped loosely in cloth. Egyptian medical practitioners had access to a surprisingly sophisticated body of accumulated knowledge, preserved in medical papyri that survive today, documents like the Edwin Smith Papyrus, which reads almost like a genuine clinical trauma manual, methodically working through case studies of injuries, symptoms, diagnosis and treatment, including remarkably accurate descriptions of skull fractures, spinal injuries, and even some of the earliest documented understanding of the brain's connection to bodily function elsewhere in the body. This isn't guesswork dressed up as medicine. This reflects genuine, careful, systematic clinical observation, accumulated and refined over countless generations of practical experience treating real injuries and illnesses. The physician sets the patient's arm with a splint made from bound wooden linen, remarkably similar in basic concept to modern splinting techniques, and there's genuine skill on display here, born from necessity in a society where physical labour injuries, construction accidents, farming mishaps, and animal-related wounds were an unavoidable daily reality. Surgical procedures did occur too, though obviously without modern anaesthesia or antiseptic understanding, relying instead on natural substances with some genuine antimicrobial properties. Honey, for instance, appears constantly throughout Egyptian medical texts as a wound treatment, and modern research has actually confirmed honey does possess real antibacterial qualities, making this ancient remedy considerably more scientifically sound than you might initially assume. But right alongside this genuinely impressive practical medicine sits something quite different, and here's where things get properly fascinating. As the physician finishes the splint, an accompanying priest-healer, sometimes the same person wearing two professional hats simultaneously, begins reciting a protective incantation, invoking specific protective deities, most commonly Sekhmet, associated with both disease and healing, or Thoth, god of wisdom and medicine, asking for divine assistance in the healing process. Magic and medicine weren't separate, competing systems here. They were understood as complementary approaches addressing different aspects of the same problem, the physical injury requiring physical treatment, while unseen spiritual or supernatural causes, believed to underlie many illnesses, required spiritual intervention alongside it. Historians still argue over exactly how ancient Egyptians themselves conceptually separated, or failed to separate, what we'd now call natural versus supernatural causes of illness. Some ailments clearly got treated with straightforward practical remedies with no magical element mentioned at all, while others involved elaborate incantations addressing demons or malevolent spirits believed to be causing symptoms, and plenty of treatments blended both approaches simultaneously. A practical remedy delivered alongside a protective spell, hedging bets across both explanatory frameworks at once, which honestly, given how limited their understanding of germ theory necessarily was, feels like a pretty reasonable, pragmatic approach to an uncertain, frightening situation. You notice a small collection of dried herbs and prepared remedies on a shelf nearby, and Egyptian pharmacology genuinely included a substantial range of plant-based treatments. Willow bark, for instance, which contains compounds chemically related to modern aspirin, used for pain relief, along with various other herbal preparations for digestive issues, fevers and skin conditions. Some remedies, admittedly, sound considerably less appealing by modern standards. Certain prescriptions called for ingredients like animal dung, believed to have protective properties against evil spirits inhabiting a wound, which modern medical historians generally view with a fair bit of justified skepticism regarding actual therapeutic benefit, and probably more than a little risk of introducing infection rather than preventing it. Dentistry existed too, unfortunately a genuinely necessary specialty given that gritty, sand-contaminated bread from earlier today, and evidence shows Egyptian dental practitioners attempting various treatments for tooth decay, abscesses, and severe wear, though without modern anaesthesia or understanding of proper oral hygiene, dental problems remained a significant, painful, chronic issue throughout Egyptian society, cutting across social classes even into the households of pharaohs themselves, whose mummified remains frequently show significant dental damage and disease. Childbirth represented another area where Egyptian medicine showed genuine practical sophistication, midwives possessing detailed accumulated knowledge of labour management, alongside protective rituals invoking deities like Bes and Taweret, specifically associated with protecting mothers and infants through the genuinely dangerous process of childbirth, which carried very real, significant mortality risk for both mother and child in the ancient world. Magic and medicine once again working in careful, deliberate tandem. You thank the physician and step back outside, the afternoon light beginning its long, slow slide toward evening, the day's heat finally starting to loosen its grip just slightly. Your stomach reminds you, gently but insistently, that it's been a long stretch since that gritty bread and thin beer this morning, and as you turn your steps toward home, the promise of dinner and the gathering warmth of family settling in together as the sun descends pulls you gently forward into the evening ahead. The light has softened by the time you make it back to your courtyard, that harsh white glare of midday finally mellowing into something gentler, gold and low across the rooftops, and the whole village seems to exhale collectively as the worst of the heat finally releases its grip. This is when ancient Egyptian family life really comes alive, the evening meal, the real anchor of the day, when everyone gathers, tired but genuinely relaxed, to eat, talk, and unwind together after hours of labour spread across fields, workshops and marketplaces. You settle onto a low mat spread across the courtyard floor, joining your family in a loose circle around shared dishes, because formal individual place settings weren't really the norm here. Most Egyptian families ate communally from shared bowls and platters, using bread itself as a practical utensil, tearing off pieces to scoop up stews, vegetables or sauces, since forks hadn't been invented yet, and honestly wouldn't be common anywhere in the world for a very long time still. Dinner tonight is more substantial than this morning's simple bread and beer. There's a thick vegetable stew, onions, leeks and lentils simmered together, flavoured with a bit of salted fish, and alongside it, fresh bread, obviously, along with a small portion of grilled duck that your father managed to trade for earlier, meat still being enough of an occasional treat that its appearance tonight feels genuinely special rather than routine. A bowl of fresh dates and figs sits nearby for dessert, sweet, sticky, and thoroughly satisfying after a long day. Wine makes an appearance too, poured from a ceramic jug into shared cups, and while beer remained the everyday household beverage, wine held a somewhat more elevated celebratory status, associated particularly with wealthier households and special occasions, though ordinary families like yours might enjoy it on evenings when circumstances allowed a little extra indulgence. Egyptian viticulture was genuinely well developed. Vineyards concentrated primarily in the Nile Delta region, and surviving wine jars sometimes even included labels noting vintage year, vineyard location, and quality grade, which is a startlingly familiar bit of continuity, essentially ancient wine labelling that wouldn't look entirely out of place on a modern bottle. As the meal continues, the mood shifts towards something lighter, more social. Your uncle starts recounting some exaggerated story about a disagreement he witnessed at the marketplace today, embellishing details with each retelling until the whole family is laughing, and it's genuinely striking how universal this feels, this exact dynamic of family dinner storytelling, someone stretching the truth just slightly for comedic effect while everyone else happily plays along, teasing and interjecting corrections. Some things really do transcend thousands of years without much alteration at all. Music often accompanied these evening gatherings too, especially in wealthier households that could afford or included musically skilled family members, and even modest families frequently had at least basic musical instruments available. You might hear someone pick up a simple reed flute or a small handheld frame drum, providing casual, relaxed background rhythm rather than formal performance. Wealthier households sometimes hired professional musicians and dancers for larger gatherings or celebrations, and Egyptian art depicts these performances in considerable lively detail. Women playing harps and lutes, dancers in dynamic, athletic poses, clearly capturing genuine movement and energy rather than static, formal posing. Historians still argue over exactly how much of Egyptian music theory and composition can be reliably reconstructed today, since no complete musical notation system survives, meaning modern attempts to recreate ancient Egyptian music remain largely educated interpretation rather than precise historical accuracy. But the sheer volume of artistic depictions showing musical performance, alongside surviving physical instruments recovered from archaeological sites, confirms music held genuine, significant cultural importance across Egyptian daily life. Not just formal religious contexts, but casual domestic evenings exactly like the one you're currently enjoying. Gossip flows freely too, as it tends to in any close-knit community, and you catch fragments of conversation about a neighbouring family's ongoing dispute over inherited farmland, speculation about whether the upcoming flood season will be generous or disappointing this year, and some mild teasing directed at your older sibling regarding a particular someone they've apparently been spending rather a lot of time with lately, prompting the exact kind of embarrassed, flustered denial that transcends every single culture and era in recorded human history, apparently including this one. As the meal winds down and dishes get cleared, the courtyard settles into a quieter, more contemplative rhythm. The sky overhead shifting from gold to deepening orange, then soft purple, stars beginning to emerge one by one in a sky remarkably unpolluted by any artificial light beyond scattered household fires and oil lamps. There's something genuinely peaceful about this transition. The day's labour and heat finally fully behind you, replaced by this soft, communal wind down, full stomachs, tired bodies, and the comfortable murmur of family voices settling gradually into calmer, quieter conversation. You lean back slightly, watching the last traces of daylight fade behind the palm trees lining the village edge, feeling genuinely, thoroughly tired in that satisfying way that comes from a long, full day. And as the evening deepens further still, your thoughts start drifting naturally toward the coming night, towards sleep, and toward the surprisingly rich, complicated relationship ancient Egyptians held with the world of dreams and the darkness waiting just beyond the edge of the firelight. The fire in the courtyard has burned down to low glowing embers, and one by one, your family members drift toward their sleeping areas, voices growing softer, movements slower, that particular unhurried quality settling over everyone that comes only at the genuine, unforced end of a long day. You make your way back toward your own sleeping mat, and as you settle down, that curved wooden headrest waiting nearby, you notice your grandmother pause at the doorway, murmuring something quiet under her breath, and you realise she's offering a small private protective prayer before settling in for the night herself. A habit so automatic and ingrained she barely seems to notice she's doing it at all. Nighttime in ancient Egypt carried genuine psychological weight beyond simple darkness and rest. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because the Egyptian relationship with night and sleep wasn't purely practical. It was deeply, seriously spiritual, wrapped up in an entire cosmology concerning vulnerability, danger, and the delicate ongoing battle maintaining cosmic order. Each night, according to Egyptian mythology, the sun god Ra travelled through the underworld in his solar bark, facing genuine mortal danger from the chaos serpent Apep, sometimes called Apophis, who attempted every single night to devour Ra and plunge existence into permanent darkness and chaos. Sunrise each morning wasn't taken for granted. It represented Ra's genuine victory in an ongoing cosmic struggle, meaning night itself was understood as a period of real vulnerability, when the protective forces of order were, quite literally, under active threat. This belief filtered directly down into ordinary household practice, which is exactly what you just witnessed with your grandmother's quiet, murmured prayer. Protective amulets, prayers, and small household rituals performed before sleep weren't purely superstitious habit, divorced from genuine belief. They represented real, sincere attempts to secure protection during this cosmologically dangerous nighttime period, when malevolent spirits, demons, and hostile supernatural forces were believed to be considerably more active and threatening than during daylight hours. You settle onto your mat, adjusting the wooden headrest beneath your neck, still not entirely used to its firm, curved shape after all these hours, though you notice it does keep your head pleasantly elevated and cool compared to the warm ground beneath you. Many headrests, interestingly, were themselves decorated with protective imagery, carved figures of the god Bez, a dwarf deity with a fierce, almost comically exaggerated, grotesque face, specifically believed to ward off evil spirits and nightmares through sheer intimidating ugliness, which is a genuinely delightful bit of ancient logic, essentially fighting supernatural threats with a deliberately terrifying object placed directly under your sleeping head. Dreams themselves held enormous significance here, understood not as random neurological noise the way modern science generally frames them, but as genuine messages, sometimes prophetic, sometimes communications from gods or deceased ancestors, requiring careful, skilled interpretation. Professional dream interpreters existed, consulted particularly by those seeking guidance on important decisions or troubled by recurring, disturbing dreams, and surviving texts like the Dream Book, part of a larger papyrus collection, actually catalogues specific dream scenarios alongside their believed meanings, a genuine ancient dream dictionary, remarkably systematic in its approach. Seeing yourself with your teeth falling out, for instance, was apparently interpreted as an omen of death among family members, while dreaming of drinking warm beer suggested coming suffering, which, considering how much this civilization genuinely loved beer, feels like a particularly ominous, almost betraying warning to receive from your own subconscious. Historians still argue over exactly how universally these specific dream interpretations applied across different regions, time periods, and social classes, since surviving interpretation texts represent a relatively narrow slice of what was likely a much broader, more varied folk tradition surrounding dream meaning throughout Egyptian history. But the underlying cultural conviction that dreams mattered, that they carried real, decodable significance worth taking seriously, appears remarkably consistent across the surviving evidence. Some individuals, particularly those seeking guidance on especially important matters, would even practice something called incubation, deliberately sleeping within a temple precinct specifically hoping to receive a significant, meaningful dream or divine visitation, essentially treating sleep itself as an active spiritual practice rather than simply passive rest, a technique that appears across quite a few other ancient religious traditions too, suggesting this particular idea, that meaningful answers might arrive through carefully cultivated sleep, held pretty widespread cross-cultural appeal throughout the ancient world. You glance toward the small protective amulet resting near your sleeping mat, the same kind you might have purchased earlier today at that bustling marketplace, and find yourself genuinely appreciating the comfort embedded in this whole belief system. However unfamiliar it might feel from your modern vantage point, there's something quietly reassuring about believing the universe operates according to knowable, addressable rules, that specific actions, a prayer, an amulet, a properly placed protective headrest carving, can meaningfully influence your safety and well-being through the vulnerable hours of darkness ahead. Your eyelids grow heavier as the last embers in the courtyard fire finally die down completely, the household around you settling into that deep, collective quiet of genuine sleep, and as your own breathing slows and softens, matching the stillness spreading through the darkened home around you, your thoughts drift, almost inevitably, towards something that touched every single aspect of ancient Egyptian life you've witnessed today, quietly present beneath the farming, the crafting, the marketplace bargaining, and the family dinners alike, the patient, ever-present awareness that this entire life, however full and vivid, was always understood as preparation for something else entirely. You're drifting now, somewhere in that soft, hazy space between waking thought and genuine sleep, and your mind, unhurried, settles on something that's been quietly present all day long, underneath every single scene you've witnessed. The fields, the temple, the marketplace, dinner, even that small protective amulet resting near your mat right now. Ancient Egyptians thought about death constantly, not with morbid dread particularly, but with the same practical, methodical attention they gave to farming schedules or household management. Death wasn't an ending here, not really. It was understood as a transition, a genuinely significant one, requiring careful, lifelong preparation. Even for ordinary people like you, like this entire household drifting off to sleep around you right now, planning for the afterlife wasn't reserved purely for pharaohs and their elaborate pyramids. Modest tombs, simple burial goods, and basic mummification, when families could afford it, represented widespread, genuinely earnest practices across Egyptian society, adjusted considerably in scale and expense depending on wealth, but reflecting the same underlying belief system regardless of social class. Wealthier families might afford elaborate multi-chamber tombs decorated with protective spells, and scenes from daily life meant to magically sustain them in the afterlife, while poorer families managed with simple pit graves, basic linen wrapping, and whatever modest grave goods they could gather. But the core conviction remained consistent throughout, that a properly prepared burial mattered enormously for what came next. Mummification itself, that elaborate process involving natron, the same mineral salt you washed your face with this very morning, existed specifically to preserve the physical body, because Egyptian belief held that the soul required its original physical form to remain intact and recognizable in the afterlife. The process, when performed thoroughly for those who could afford full treatment, involved removing internal organs, treating the body with natron for weeks to fully dry it out, then wrapping it carefully in layers of linen, often with protective amulets tucked between the wrappings at specific points, corresponding to areas believed to need extra spiritual defense. Beyond the body itself, Egyptian afterlife belief centered on a genuinely fascinating concept of ultimate moral judgment, a scene depicted repeatedly across tombs and funerary texts, showing the deceased's heart being weighed on a great scale against the feather of Mahat, that same concept of truth, justice, and cosmic order you learned about earlier today watching temple rituals. If your heart, understood as the seat of conscience and moral character, balanced properly against that feather, proving you'd lived a genuinely just, honest life, you'd be granted passage into a peaceful, abundant afterlife existence, often imagined as an idealized reflection of familiar earthly life, complete with fields to farm and family to enjoy, just without any hardship, illness, or suffering. Fail that judgment, and a fearsome composite creature called Amit, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, waited to devour the failed heart, resulting in a genuine, permanent spiritual annihilation, a fate considered far worse than simple death itself. Historians still argue over exactly how literally ordinary Egyptians understood this judgment scene, versus how much functioned as moral instruction and cultural storytelling, encouraging ethical behaviour throughout life, rather than representing a precisely literally anticipated future event. But regardless of that theological nuance, the underlying message clearly permeated everyday Egyptian ethics, that how you lived, your honesty, your treatment of others, your fulfillment of social and religious obligations carried genuine, lasting consequence extending well beyond your physical lifetime. This is why, honestly, so much of what you witness today connects back to this larger framework. Those craftsmen building stone monuments this morning, working toward permanence and eternity. Those scribes training so rigorously, preserving knowledge and religious texts meant to guide souls through the afterlife journey. Those temple rituals maintaining cosmic order, that same Ma'at your heart would eventually be weighed against. even that marketplace amulet, that protective headrest carving, all of it connects into this same continuous thread, an entire civilization organizing itself consciously and consistently around the conviction that this life, vivid and full as it clearly was, represented preparation for something considerably larger and more permanent still. And now, gently, softly, let your own thoughts loosen from all of that, because tonight, right now, isn't about judgment or preparation or eternity. It's simply about rest. Let the weight of the day settle out of your shoulders, slow and easy, the way that Nile water settled overnight in its jar, sediment sinking quietly away, until only calm, clear stillness remains. Let your breathing slow, unhurried, matching the soft, steady rhythm of this ancient household drifting into genuine, peaceful sleep, all around you, mother, father, grandmother, siblings, even that self-satisfied cat curled somewhere in its favourite shadowed corner, all of it settling, softening, quieting. The stars continue their own slow, patient journey overhead, exactly as they always have, exactly as they will again tomorrow, and there's something genuinely comforting in that continuity, that same quiet rhythm connecting this ancient night to your own, right now, wherever and whenever you happen to be listening from. You don't need to hold on to anything more tonight. No more facts, no more history, no more wondering what comes next. Just let this warm, sleepy stillness carry you gently under, soft and unhurried, like the slow current of the Nile itself, patient, steady, and endlessly, endlessly calm. End of script. Sweet dreams.